University of Louvain-la-Neuve in Belgium, and he's here this year on sabbatical leave, hosted by my group. It's been delightful to have him. I think I can safely say that Patrick is probably one of the world's leading land system scientists. He's published numerous papers on kind of both theoretical and empirical work on the causes, patterns, and impacts of land use change around the world. I first came across his work when he published a fabulous empirical piece in PNAS, where he showed that there are a lot of countries that were showing forest transition, where forests, there's deforestation and they switch to forest recovery, and that looks really good. But he showed that a lot of that was occurring through trade, where countries are essentially exporting their deforestation to other countries. Since then, he's published numerous theoretical and empirical pieces. He very nimbly mixes those in his work. But in addition to his work, he's also been a real leader in land system science. He's really organized our community and published several synthetic pieces. Couple of notable ones are, he did a piece, land use change always struggles to know what theories are we based on. And so he published a paper on middle range theories that are used in land system science, where I essentially borrow theories from many other disciplines to build our work. He also very recently published a paper on, what do we, trying to synthesize, what do we know about land system science in a way that's useful for policy? So he published a paper called 10 Facts on Land Systems. With that, today he's going to talk about supply chains and their traceability. Join me in welcoming Patrick.
Thanks, Navin, and thanks everyone for the attention provided. So today I'm going to talk, as the title says, about how the work that we do to try to improve traceability and transparency in commodity supply chain, in particular in agricultural commodity supply chain, and how in turn it can improve the sustainability. And somehow it relates to this old work that I did a long time ago about forest transition and displacement. So it's a super collaborative and collective work with a lot of great people, including at UC Louvain, Erasmus Gassen, Thiago Reis, Cécile Renier, and many other collaborators in different institutions, gathered, among others, through the TRACE initiative, which is coordinated by Stockholm Environment Institute and Global Canopy. So it's a super collaborative and super also fun to work with all these super bright people. Yep. Okay. So I will say a few words about the issues that are related to sustainability in land use and then in food system, and then which are this embedded in commodity supply chain. But I'm not going to go in full depth, but to give you an idea, and then I will say something about the governance interventions that are already in place or emerging to address these issues, and I will try to show that these interventions face some issues related to traceability and transparency, and I will try to explain how we do to improve on these issues, and in particular how to trying to map supply chains and commodities from as close as possible to the place where they are produced and where much of the impacts happen, and then downstream through all the supply chain steps that they happen after. And then I will give you key insights that we have gained in terms of knowledge about land use and supply chains by doing this traceability and transparency work, and then I will try to come up with conclusion, putting all that together. So, okay, before there are supply chains, there's land use, where the products that then enter the supply chains are produced. So land use is really central to a lot of sustainability issues, biodiversity conservation, climate change, energy poverty alleviation, food security, etc., etc. And agriculture for food production is a key land use globally in terms of the extent, the dominance, the impacts, etc., etc. So about 90% or more of the tropical deforestation that occurs in agricultural landscape. About 60% of threatened or near threatened species are threatened by agriculture. About 35% of greenhouse gas emissions from anthropogenic sources are from the food system, about 23% from land use. So these are really those that happen at the farm site, in the production place, etc., about 11% from deforestation. So a lot of issues. For the rest of the talk, I will mainly focus on deforestation because it's a key impact of land use and it's a key sustainability issues that relates to many others, including biodiversity conservation, greenhouse gas emissions, etc. But the work that we do also relates and can be used for a number of other issues, social, environmental issues, beyond deforestation, but I take deforestation because this is our entry point somehow. So a lot of these impacts happen at the production place, but then these products often enter into supply chains. Most of these agricultural products are not consumed by farmers themselves. Sometimes this supply chain can be very long and complex, so the products are transported, traded, processed, retailed, and then consumed. So all these actors along the supply chain, which to a certain number of extent involve international trade, they can be quite distant and remote from the production side and from the impacts. But to some extent, they all gain value and derive value from these commodities. And so in a certain way, they probably should be held responsible, at least partly, for the impacts that are related to these products like deforestation, and should have a leverage capacity to act upon. But the question is, how do we reconnect these? How do we make downstream actors in the supply chain exerting the leverage power to try to change production practices on the ground? So that's not a new problem or newly discovered issues. It's something that has been shown repeatedly for many years. And as Navin said, it's something that I've been work in the past to try to just show that some of the deforestation, for example, is embodied in trade. So there's a number of governance interventions that are meant to address these issues and make supply chain actors, consumers, companies, etc., to take the responsibility and try to either incentivize or mandate producers on the ground to change their practices. There's multiple instruments, some are private, some are public, some are hybrid. I will just give you a flavor by taking two exemplary schemes. One is a private scheme. So it's this statement of purpose that 10 major companies that are really key players in commodities that are mostly responsible for deforestation, soy from South America, palm oil from Southeast Asia, etc. And so these 10 companies, now 14, made this statement at the Glasgow Climate COP in 2021 that they would commit to eliminate deforestation from the products that they trade. And then the next year in 2022, at COP27, they released a roadmap trying to explain how they will do it, commodity per commodity, with different deadlines, different schemes, etc., etc. So that's an example of private commitment towards zero deforestation by really major players in the sector. And an example of a public scheme, a prominent public scheme, is the EU due diligence law on deforestation that is incoming. So the European Union bodies have agreed to come up with a law that would require companies to prove that the products that they place on the European markets are free from deforestation and legal. And it requires that these companies collect very precise information about the geographic sourcing, where the product comes from, so that they can demonstrate that the products are indeed free from deforestation. So that is an example of a public scheme where public government, public actors make decisions, but that works through supply chain, because these public decisions, they mandate supply chain actors to do certain things. So that's great and very promising, but there's still a lot of issues that remain. And in particular, that if you want to implement these private commitments or these public requirements, you have to have information about where your products come from to know whether they are associated with some impacts or not, and what you can do about it. But supply chains are very opaque. The information on the origin of products is often not retained all along the supply chain. And that's by design of commodity markets. When you're trading a commodity, you don't need to know where the product comes from. You only need to know that it conforms to a set of standards that define your commodity, but you don't need necessarily to know where it comes from. But the impacts on the ground are very heterogeneous. So if you're trading certain commodities, some commodities are associated with a lot of deforestation, some not, etc. So you need to know a little bit where it comes from. And this opacity, this lack of transparency tends to obscure the responsibility. It's hard to know whose actors are responsible for some impacts. It removes the accountability. So whose actor should feel an onus to act on these impacts, and it hides leverage. So which actors have the capacity to do something about these issues. So this is where the role of traceability and transparency comes into play. So traceability in the strict sense is the information that companies have about the supply chain, to what extent they are able to know where their products come from, and so what are the impacts associated with these products. And so it's derived from that the capacity to map certain flows of products across the supply chain. So from where they are produced to where they are consumed. And transparency is the public disclosure and usability of that information. So the fact that not only companies can trace their own supply chain, but other actors, other companies, consumer, government, civil society can also have access and use that information to trigger decisions, to make their own decisions, etc., etc. And proper transparency means information not only about the traceability of the products, but to have a proper transparency system, we need to have information about many other things, financial transaction, the impacts, so which products are associated with more or less impacts, the commitments that companies have made, the activities that they actually implement, and whether they are effective or not. And if we have all of that, then we can say that we have proper transparency on supply chains and their impacts. So we try to improve on these with different goals. So the kind of theory of change that we have is that improving on traceability and transparency can help to navigate the complexity, so help to know where are the impacts, what are the risks associated with that product or this product and this company, etc. To help actors to manage the risks themselves, so actors in the supply chain, companies, governments, consumers, what can they know about the impacts of the products that they trade or consume, and how they can act to mitigate risks that they're exposed to. But of course, that's not the end goal. It's not, the goal is not to help actors to clean their own supply chain. The goal, of course, at the end is to operate changes on the ground and fix sustainability issues that are in the production sites. And through all that, to try to assess assess progress, be able to benchmark and see what actors are improving or not improving, what solutions can work, not work, etc., etc. So this is the goal of putting more transparency. How do we do that? We use this approach that we called spatially explicit information on production to consumption systems. And the goal is to provide some kind of middle ground approach for tracing products and supply chain. So on the one hand, you have life cycle analysis, which are often very precise, very detailed, very accurate, and which companies use to trace certain products and the impacts of these products, the environmental, sustainability impacts of these products throughout the life cycle. The issue with this life cycle analysis is that they are often hard to scale up. They are based on data from certain companies or specific products. It's hard to get the picture of a whole sector with that, and so compare actors with each other. Sometimes companies have their own LCA standards that are not necessarily easy to compare with other companies. So that's one side of the spectrum, if you want. The other side of the spectrum is there's a number of country-to-country trade database, so which track products flowing through international trade from one country to another and attach environmental or sustainability or social impacts to these products. 1 ton of soy exported from Brazil to Belgium has so much deforestation, etc. The problem with that one is that it lacks granularity. So as I said, the impacts can be very heterogeneous. They can be heterogeneous within a country, within production systems. So country to country, they average out all these this heterogeneity, and they don't identify the actors that are operating the supply chain. So what we're looking at is a kind of wall-to-wall approach that is able to map entire sectors of a certain commodity in a certain country. We don't try to map the whole globe and have the whole commodities, etc. We focus on the key commodities and the key countries that have the most impact, in particular for deforestation, because as I said, that is our focus. We try to have subnational supply chain mapping, so something where we are able to trace the product as close as possible to the place where it was produced, and then tracing to what it happens then in the supply chain, and identify the actors, so in particular the companies that are operating these flows. And when we have traced the products, we want to be able to link that with social and environmental impacts on the ground, such as, for example, deforestation. How do we do that? I will explain that with the work from Erasmus, who I'm guessing, on exports of Brazilian beef meat, but the general logic is always the same. But for every country and every commodity, etc., there's always some tricky things, etc. But the basic logic is the same. So I'm going to explain that here. Basically, how do? We stitch together a bunch of publicly available data. So we have customs data. These customs data, typically they will record a shipment of a certain product, for example, in this case, beef meat from Brazil, from the port where it's being exported, or put on a boat to be exported to the port of destination in a given country. And it typically gives you, in principle, it gives you the information on the company that is exporting this product, the company that is importing it also, if it's a different one. So you have traceability about the actors that are there. But also, in general, it gives you more than that. It gives you information about the processing point or the aggregation point where this product was prepared to be put in the shipment. So if we take Brazilian beef, for example, these customs data give you information about the slaughterhouse where the beef was slaughtered and processed to be exported. This is really a key element. That's what we call logistic hubs. So it's this intermediary point where the products are aggregated or processed. It depends on the commodity. In this case, it's slaughterhouse. For soy, for example, it can be silos, or it can be processing mills. For palm oil, it can be cooperatives for cocoa. But we always try to look for these intermediate points. And then we have remote sensing, land cover and land use maps, and agricultural statistics that are disaggregated, for example, in Brazil at the level of municipalities that tells us where is beef produced, where is pasture expansion, where there is deforestation for pasture expansion, for example, etc., etc. And then we link the two with animal movement records in Brazil, for example, which are mandatory to record when you have an animal that is sold from one farm, moved from one farm to another farm, or from farm to a slaughterhouse. And we have tax records that identify with tax numbers to make sure that we can verify the identity of the slaughterhouse and its location, and the farm and its location. And so from that, we are able to reconstruct all this chain from the municipality to the consuming countries. I had a lot of complexity, of course. It looks maybe a bit simple, but it's super complicated. But the basic logic is that. So from that, we have these supply chain maps, which looks a little bit like that. This is the supply chain from cocoa from Côte d'Ivoire. We have a map where we know where in the country these are departments, or which departments in the country cocoa is produced. We have maps that tell us what's where cocoa is grown, where there is deforestation associated with this cocoa. And then we can have these kind of Sankey flows where we are able to say this cocoa is flowing from this department to logistic hubs. Here we have cooperatives, and then the exporter groups, so the companies that buy from these cooperatives, and then the country of destination. You see, for example, in yellow, the supply chain of cocoa flowing to the Netherlands, and in red to Belgium, and we are able then to link that to impacts such as deforestation, etc., that happens in these places. As I said, we don't cover the entire set of contexts and commodities, etc., etc. Try to focus on those commodities and those contexts where most of the deforestation is concentrated, but we also then link that to other kinds of impacts. And our team at UC Louvain doesn't work on all of these things. We do work on some of these things. Other people do work on other of these things. But all in all these data and all these supply chain reconstructions are transparently available on this Trace initiative website, trace.earth, when you can browse, download, etc., etc. For the record, there's a whole other part of the initiative which is concerned about financial actors, so which financial actors put money into the companies that produce and trade these commodities. But I'm not opening this finance box for the sake of time, but so you know that this is also a part of the project. Okay, so the goal of this initiative, the goal of this data is to help, as I said, real-world actors to make real-world decisions about their sourcing, etc. But by doing that, we also are interested to gain better insight and better knowledge about the supply chain. So I will tell you a few words about some of the key insight that we gain, and for each, I will pick a concrete context to illustrate that. So, for example, reconstructing the supply chain of Argentinian soil, what does it show? It shows that much of the deforestation impacts are concentrated in a very few places, hotspots of deforestation, and a few actors. So actually, much of the soy exports from Argentina are not really related to deforestation. So it's possible to identify and bound the problem and see which are the key actors to engage with. It's not the case for all commodities, but it's a pattern that is repeated for a number of other commodities: Brazilian soy, Indonesian palm oil, and others. From the work of Erasmus on Brazilian beef exports, what do we see? We see, well, that's a follow-up of the previous point, somehow that actors' exposure to deforestation or other impacts is highly heterogeneous. So that's what you see on the blue bars on the left. So these are the main traders that export beef from Brazil, and you see that per ton of beef that they export, they have very heterogeneous deforestation risk. Some have very high deforestation, some very low, and that depends on where they're sourced in the country, what are their policies, etc., etc. So again, it shows that it's possible to identify and rank the actors, etc. This work also showed that export markets matter, but for some commodities, and Brazilian beef is the key example, domestic markets matter also a lot. So about 80% of the Brazilian beef is consumed domestically, and about the same share of deforestation ends up in the domestic market. So for these markets, our customs data approach doesn't work, of course. So we're working on other kinds of ways to gather data with citizen science and crowdsourcing approach. I'm not explaining that in detail, but it's important to have this in mind, that these domestic markets for certain commodities are very key. Cocoa from Côte d'Ivoire, that's a work from Cécile Renier. What it shows was that even when putting all the efforts that we could to gather all the data that were available, etc., we're able to trace basically about 45% of the cocoa down up to the cooperative where it was first purchased. And about 55% we cannot trace, either because it's exported by traders that are totally intransparent. They don't reveal anything about anything. They're a black box. They're not even responding to email or whatever. Or about 24% of the cocoa is indirectly sourced, which means that the traders that export this cocoa, actually, they don't buy it from farmers or from cooperatives. They buy it from local intermediaries, so small-scale domestic traders that go across the countries with their trucks and they buy cocoa from cooperatives. And that cocoa is extremely hard to trace because of the pattern of these small-scale traders. There's a lot of controversy about cocoa and deforestation of Côte d'Ivoire. In Côte d'Ivoire, some narratives saying that basically cocoa is responsible for all the deforestation in Côte d'Ivoire. Some narratives saying, no, it's not at all related to cocoa. Deforestation is food crops, etc., etc. What we show is that basically it's half. So clearly it means that addressing deforestation from cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire is a key way to reduce deforestation, but it's also not sufficient. And in contrast a bit with the Brazilian beef example, here again, you have the distribution of cocoa deforestation per ton of cocoa traded for the main traders in the upper part and for the main countries of destination in the lower part. And what you see here is that deforestation for cocoa is really embedded all across the supply chain. There is heterogeneity, but it's much lower than the Brazilian beef. So basically, it's a very pervasive issue. Indirect sourcing, so that's a follow-up from the work a little bit that I was mentioning about, the point that I was mentioning about cocoa. So we took 4 key commodities: soy from Brazil, palm oil from Indonesia, cocoa from Côte d'Ivoire, leaf cattle export from Brazil. And it shows that in all these commodities, this pattern of indirect sourcing, so traders that source from small-scale intermediaries operating in the domestic market, is highly prevalent. And it's a major blind spot for sustainable initiatives, because until recently, at least, most of the commitments made by companies to achieve zero deforestation and clean their supply chain, etc., were only made for the direct sourcing. So there was a small footnote somewhere saying, oh, it's only our direct sourcing, or even no footnote at all. But when you do the math, you realize that they only commit for the direct sourcing. So it really shows that it's necessary to embed these indirect sourcing more in the supply chain initiatives. Our work on supply chain also showed that the configuration and the temporal variability of this supply chain matters a lot. So that's the work from Thiago Reis on stickiness. So if you look at the graph, you see some trading relations remain very stable from one year to another. And some farmers consistently sell to the same trader, etc. Other relations are very unstable and reconfigure every year. And it matters a lot for the implementation of these supply chain policies. If you imagine that you're a trader that makes a commitment to have zero deforestation, and you have very consistent, stable, long-term relationships with a number of farmers who supply you, it's probably likely that you can engage with them and convince them to change their practices. In contrast, if you're a trader that has a totally volatile sourcing patterns, you're buying on the spot market with different people every year, maybe it's easy for you to clean your supply chain. You just have to buy where it's deforestation free, but you're not necessarily going to operate change on the ground. And the last point before conclusion, by doing all this reconstruction of supply chain and attributing that deforestation to commodity, we see that indeed there's quite a lot of the deforestation that we can attribute to some kinds of land use and agricultural commodity production. And that's the part on the left of the graph. But realize that in fact, there's also a huge part, about a third to half of deforestation, that does not result at all in recorded productive agricultural land. So this share doesn't enter any supply chain because people don't produce anything, at least produce anything recorded on these lands. So it can be because they clear the land for speculation, then they abandoned it, or they clear the land, but there was a conflict of tenure between different people, and so nobody ends up really being able to use the land, or they clear the land and the farmer realized that it wasn't really a good land to produce something, etc., etc. So when we put all of this together, what does it show? Well, there's good sides and then there's bad sides. Right? That's life, right? On the good side, we show that it's really possible to reconstruct supply chain with a high granularity, identify the actor, link that to impact on the ground. That often, it's not the case for all commodities, but for quite a number of commodities in context, much of the impacts are concentrated in a few hotspots and actors. So it's possible to target those that really need to be targeted. There's still a lot of knowledge gaps and etc. There's always going to be, but we know really already enough to act, make policies, etc. There's really no reason to delay any kind of intervention. And these supply chain interventions, I have not opened all the box of the econometric analysis where we try to evaluate the impact of the supply chain intervention using this supply chain data, but there's a whole bunch of work on this. Also, we can show that they have an impact. They don't fix everything, but they definitely have to be part of the policy mix. So that's the good side. The bad side is there's a lot of caveats and issues. So indirect sourcing is a major blind spot, as I said, and it's there to stay because these local traders, they play an important role in the supply chain, and it's hard to address that with supply chain interventions. Domestic markets matter a lot for certain commodities, and they are also hard to address with big traders' supply chain approach. The configuration of supply chain and the volatility and stickiness has a big role to play also in how you can design interventions, and a large share of deforestation does not even turn into productive agriculture that ends up in supply chain. So it's very hard because supply chain actors would tend to say, this is not my responsibility. So when you take all these caveats together, it shows that really traceability and transparency have a role to play. They can do a lot, but certainly this kind of supply chain approach alone, they cannot fix the problem of deforestation. It really requires that supply chain actors enter in more genuine partnerships with producers, local governments on the ground, consumer governments, civil societies, to have interventions that not only focus on cleaning supply chain, but also really on achieving more sustainable rural development, basically in territorial governance in this production place, addressing issues like land tenure, conflicts, land zoning, operation failures, and all these kind of messy things that are not directly related to supply chain, but still matter a lot for sustainability and deforestation. And that was it. So as it's written, I'm there until end of June here at UBC. I'm very happy for that. And so I'm happy to engage and discuss with those who want. Thank you.
Very interesting talk, very much. I don't know a lot of this, but I have a question that kind of comes up from one of the last remarks. Can you use this kind of supply chain analysis to get at that local policy in the countries where supply comes from? Or is this almost just like a completely different approach to addressing sustainability problems? Like, you see the intersection of this and some of those other governance and sustainability things that you're doing?
Well, one of the things in which it, the question is, what is the intersection between this supply chain approach and the more territorial-based approach, right? More or less. One of the key intersection is being able to identify who are the actors to which we can engage. So in many of these contexts, for example, in this indirect sourcing of cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire, it's hard to necessarily go to the very precise information. Cooperatives we can trace to some extent, but even there's a lot of messiness. In fact, farmers sell to different cooperatives, etc. But at least there's some kind of geographical bounding to some territories, and so we are able to say these and these and these traders are the traders that operate in this part of the country. And so if we want to gather actors around the table in a certain territory, at least these are the actors that we engage with. So that probably is one of the key aspects. Or of course, not just the traders, but also the downstream actors. If you are a country like Belgium, and you can at least identify what are the regions in Brazil, what are the states in Brazil in which you have the most impacts, and so you can try to put also actors around the table there. There was a question on the back, maybe there. Yep. Okay. So the question is how we can provide evidence about the impact of these supply chain interventions. There's many works on that. Usually they would take some kind of econometric approach to, well, based on some counterfactual approach. So if you take places that have supply chain intervention where traders that operate. So again, because we are able to identify which traders operate in which places. So if we know that a certain trader has a zero deforestation commitment and is requesting their suppliers to provide soy or cattle meat with zero deforestation, and other traders don't have such a commitment, we are able to look at where they operate in the ground and see if actually over the course of, let's say, before and after the commitment, for example, is there a reduction in deforestation in these areas? There's a lot of course, technical issues with that, comparing the proper counterfactual, making sure that you control for the other factors that could influence deforestation in the place, etc., etc. But the basic logic is that. I don't know, yeah, could enter in more detail, but that's the basic logic. Do I have to pick the questions? Yeah. Or? Yeah, Anna?
Thank you. You just actually started to allude to it in that response. I was wondering how time factors into your analysis. And I was thinking back to the slide you showed about Argentina saying, you know, deforestation is happening here, but there's no evidence that that's turning into agricultural factors. So over what time scale you kind of make those?
Yep. What is the time scale over which we can we make the assessments, and therefore we can decide that some places or some products are associated with deforestation and others not? That's of course. Yeah. So the time lag over which we calculate that depends on the commodities, because it depends on these kind of systems. Some things like cattle ranching, basically you can clear the land and put cows. So you have a longer time lag. So we adjust the time lag a little bit depending on these different things. And so there's two things. There's a time lag and there's a kind of amortization period. So for example, we will say, let's say, take the example of cocoa from Côte d'Ivoire. We take the deforestation, we take cocoa that is exported in 2019. And we look at the deforestation that is happening between 2000 and 2015 by saying deforestation that happens after 2015 cannot be linked to cocoa that is produced, that is exported in 2019. It's too early. It takes several years for cocoa to grow. But we go back to 2000 by saying deforestation that happened in 2000, the cocoa produced 20 years later should bear some kind of responsibility. I mean, there's technical aspects to that, knowing the system, etc. But I think the core, the big point is that it's very much a question of incentives, and where you draw the line depends on that. Because if you take a very long amortization period, basically you are failing to be relevant today, because if the land was deforested 30 years ago, maybe the people are not there, etc., etc. And what you want to give is incentives today for actors that are there today to change their behavior today and tomorrow. But if you take too short amortization period, also you're basically forgiving actors after a few years. And so you're saying to actors, well, if you deforest and you try to stay under the radar for a few years, it's going to be okay. So it's a bit of a tricky thing in that, yeah. Unless it's a, yeah, no. Go.
Thank you. Great talk. And just following on this, frankly stunned by that saying that 36% of the forest is converted to agriculture. What of that is the non-high and I just mentioned, or for using of timber or poison?
Just trying to make sure there the time lag is 10 years. I think I'm going to be killed if I make a mistake, but it's at least 10 years. Oh, sorry. How much of the deforestation that does not result in productive agriculture land is linked to this time lag. Or other things. Yeah. So maybe it's 15 years. I'm not totally sure. Maybe it's 15 years. But so we have a sufficiently long time lag to say if the land was deforested 15 years ago and there's still not agriculture on it, maybe at some point it will come. But at least it shows that the deforestation is a bit problematic in that sense. It's excluding in principle deforestation that is really due to timber extraction, etc. Now, in most of the timber extraction in a sense should not be recorded as deforestation. We record deforestation here if there's a proper change in land use. So not if you just clear the forest and then regrow it, etc. In principle, it's not there. It's possible that some of these land was cleared and the timber was harvested and sold, but still there's no proper logging, like regular forestry activity taking place in these areas. So maybe they were just cleared and logged once, but they are still in agricultural landscape. And they are still in landscapes where most of the agriculture, the deforestation is for agriculture, and most of the land use expansion is agriculture. Some of that may be unrecorded. So I think it's really important because it's when trying to navigate a bit a very thin line here, because some of that deforestation, I think most of that deforestation is probably the most useless deforestation that happens. It's really that. It's land speculation, crop booms, crop failures, and stuff like that. But part of that deforestation is probably what I would call the most useful deforestation. So deforestation that goes for actually productive agriculture, but it is totally unrecorded, marginal smallholders doing stuff that nobody cares about and nobody even records. Probably, well, in that sense, it's the most useful deforestation because it's the most vulnerable population too. But well, it should be a relatively small part of that. That's there. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for the talk. That's interesting. How much are you concerned about sorting? You have different traders. You're a trader who cares a lot about the environment, trader doesn't. And so in the end, what might happen is that I buy the stuff from the deforestation frontier, you buy the stuff from the forest. And although we can see how you have environment, how big you find environmentally friendly sort of stuff, there's no net impact on conservation. It's kind of this deforestation stuff that's the trade.
Yeah.
See any of that?
Yeah. Trying to repeat the question. Okay. Basically, how much we care about the fact that some actors can clean the supply chain by buying clean products, but without necessarily driving changes on the ground. And it can be just shifting the supply. It's a big issue. It's a super crucial issue, etc. As I said, well, obviously we are concerned about that. I don't care whether a trader cleans their own supply chain or not. I don't even care whether I buy chocolate that is deforestation free. What matters for me is that there's no deforestation in the cocoa production. Part of that is related to this notion of stickiness and volatility of supply chain. So we're trying to use that also a bit as a diagnostic tool to say those traders that historically have had an extremely volatile pattern, in a sense, we expect that they may clean their supply chain easily, but not necessarily operate much changes on the ground. But they are not the majority. The majority of traders, they do have some kind of relatively stable supply base because they have infrastructure. They also have silos and slaughterhouse and things like that. So they are also a little bit geographically bound to the place, at least to some extent. But we're trying to keep track of that and document that. Now, well, to some extent, it's still better to do something rather than not. So the European Union due diligence deforestation law, maybe now it's targeting 12% of deforestation that enters in commodity supply chain or something like that. So it's not fixing the problem in itself, but at some point, you can hope that it has some leverage power also, because some actors may at some point feel it easier to clean their own supply chain, even for serving certain markets. So if you sell sufficient amount of soy, for example, to the European Union, you may have an easier time having your entire supply chain deforestation free, rather than just supplying deforestation free product to the European Union and keeping track of all the deforestation embedded products and sell it to China. It's complicated when you're operating commodities. So there's a bit of that. There's a bit of this leverage idea that if actors like the European Union do not just say, we want companies to provide clean deforestation products, but we also want them to engage with producers on the ground, that it can have stronger impacts. And what empirically I think we show is that there's always some of that, there's always some leakage, but it's never 100%. So it's always a bit of mixed bag. It depends on the commodities, depends on the place in commodities, but a quarter, sometimes when there's half of the policy that is counteracted by leakage, that to me is really a big failure, but it's sometimes it can be more like a quarter, 15%, 20%. So yeah, it depends. Yep.
I had a question, so I actually really had the same question as Frederick. And it made me think also you could maybe track if the bifurcation, like between a deforested versus non-deforested cocoa, happen, we could maybe look at prices of the two. If it was cheaper to one or the other. But anyway, so that's a really big issue. That, related to my question about the earth use, you have like a historic session with tropical specific deforestation, and that has like had this cyclical feedback loop with, okay, we have good data on that, so we're going to focus on that first. And I know that this is an early phase, but I was wondering if you had to choose a second variable after tropical deforestation to add dimension to your sustainability analysis, what would that second variable be? You know, even if it has to do with how acceptable the data is for you, but also how indicative it is of a different.
Yeah.
This is the same question, but on the other side of the equation. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, I'll talk to you later about it.
Okay, maybe I will take a trick to respond to your question. What additional variables we could add beyond tropical deforestation, or what would better? I would say my first one is something that is in the pipeline of many teams, but is conversion of non-forest ecosystems. Because I think tropical deforestation is still a good proxy for many impacts, biodiversity, carbon, etc. But we're still missing the non-forest ecosystem. But beyond that, I would go probably for more social indicators, labor, poverty. That's it? Okay, thank you.